Hey guys, and welcome to another Walk-In Wednesday. Now this one walked in several months ago, and I'm ashamed to say that it didn't make any sense to me. Well, let me explain what happened. One of our YouTube subscribers sent us this gun and said, hey, it has a really cool story behind it. The guy who sent this home was in D-Day as a frogman. Actually, it was the Scouts and Raiders at that time. Nicknamed the Frogmen, and then later became the Navy SEALs. He basically said this was brought back after D-Day by a Navy SEAL. When I looked at it, I realized this is a Mauser broomhandle that went to the Chinese Army back in the 20s. So the story didn't make any sense. How did he get it? I looked up a few things, and again, it didn't make any sense. So I put it aside and forgot about it. And then a little while later, I heard from the gentleman that sent it over and said, hey, whatever happened to my video? So that caused me to dig it up again and begin to do a little bit of research. And that led me to a lot of, I found a treasure trove of information about this gentleman, Grant G Andreasen. So you can tell from the photo that he was in the US Navy, but there's so much more to this story, and all of this begins to make sense as we look through his military career. So Grant, I did see in one communication, I believe they called him Buck. So Grant enlisted in the US Navy in 1942. If you look here, we actually have a copy of his draft card. You know, the amazing thing about the internet is a lot of this old data and documents have been scanned into websites such as Ancestry.com. And you can see Grant's actual signature right here at the bottom. You can also see his height and his weight, 175. He was a phenomenal athlete. He was actually in college at the time, 24 years of age when he enlisted. And he was on the football team at Utah State. And he was also studying physical education to become a physical education instructor. And that's when the war broke out, of course, in December of '41, and then he enlisted in the Navy in 1942. His specialization was physical education, teaching people how to get fit and trim, and he was therefore selected for a special unit that was formed soon after the beginning of the war, soon after Pearl Harbor. The higher-ups got together and said, you know, we need some special forces to do clandestine work behind enemy lines. And that's where they first formed the units of the Scouts and Raiders. Again, actually this is their patch, or this logo that they used, and you can see it's a picture of a frog on there, and also they wore green wetsuits. And that's where they got the nickname Frogmen. Later, and by the way, it was about 1945 that the name became Navy SEALs. So these were the first of the Navy SEALs, and Grant was among the first unit to be picked. Actually, he was the fourth man picked for this unit out of 10 men. So the first Navy SEAL, or Scouts and Raiders, the first ones, there were 10 men that were picked, and Grant was among the first. So in 1942, with the rest of these men, he was sent off to Fort Pierce, Florida, and that's where they received special training. In fact, they talk about Hell Week, which if you ever watch a special about Navy SEALs, they still do Hell Week, where they actually torture people, waterboard them, put them through all kinds of difficult training to make sure that they become the best of the best. Now, the kinds of things that he was trained for was underwater demolition, removal of mines, planting of mines, putting magnetic mines onto ships and blowing them up, also removing obstacles whenever they had to do a landing. Most of their activities were top secret, so it wasn't talked about as much, and that's why part of my confusion when I looked up his naval history, it actually said he was a scout boat pilot. And I didn't think that sounded very glamorous. He's a scout boat pilot. I mean, how difficult can that job be? But then, again, I learned a lot more in reading through one of the commendations that he got. He actually went in before the landings in North Africa. His team would go in. Again, they would scout out the territory. They actually would go up on land at night. They would keep track of the sentries when they come on, when they go off, how long their rotation was. They took sand samples and soil samples to make sure their trucks could function in the sand, that it wasn't too soft. If there was reefs in the way, they would blow them up. If there was obstacles, they would get rid of those. And so they truly were special forces. And a lot of their missions came from the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services, and that was the forerunner of the CIA. So he was at the beginning of this whole CIA Navy SEALs connection all the way back in the beginning of World War II. So I mentioned that he and his team were involved in the invasion of North Africa, also Sicily in 1943, and then later in Salerno, Anzio landing, and then finally he was shipped off to England in 1943, where he began to gather data for the invasion at Normandy Beach. So this was, again, news to me. I know D-Day was on June 6th of 1944, but Grant, actually his initial missions, scouting the beaches, was in January of 1944. So you're talking about the English Channel in the middle of winter, January of 44. Now, I have to laugh to myself a little bit because he was trained in Fort Pierce, Florida. I have been in that water, and it's not that bad. But suddenly now he's thrust into the English Channel, and it's January, getting ready for the invasion months ahead of time. I actually saw an interview on YouTube I was watching. It wasn't Grant, but another one of these frogmen in World War II, and he said, the only thing I was armed with was a bathing suit and a dagger. And they would actually survey the landing sites. They took soil samples. They did clear paths. Now, the Germans had built up obstacles right off the beachhead. They put up obstacles to stop any of the landing craft that would try to come in. He would actually remove those obstacles or blow them up. I'm not sure how that happened, but they removed the obstacles and they made pathways for the landing craft to come through. And so that there were a number of them, and specifically he worked on Omaha Beach before the invasion. And then on D-Day, on the actual day, he was a scout boat pilot who led the way on the first wave of the invasion. And he knew exactly where the channel was because he had mapped it out himself, and he brought all the landing craft that came in behind him. He led the way for that. And for his activities on D-Day, he received the Navy Cross. Now, the Navy Cross is the second highest award for valor that you can get in the U.S. Navy. So, of course, the first is the Congressional Medal of Honor. Next is the Navy Cross, and that's what he received. Let me just read the citation that came from the President when he received his Navy Cross. The President of the United States of America takes pleasure in presenting the Navy Cross to Lieutenant Grant G. Andreasen for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of duty, piloting his scout boat during the amphibious assault on Normandy coast off of France on June 6, 1944. Lieutenant Andreasen embarked in one of the first craft to approach the strongly defended Normandy coast and succeeded in a highly important mission of locating the beaches to be assaulted. Despite heavy surf and harassing enemy fire, he went in close to the beach to act as a guide for the approaching wave of landing craft. While he was in this advanced position, he fired the rockets from his craft at target objectives and moved in closer to the beach. He rendered close fire support for the enemy assault. In addition, without regard to his own personal safety and under heavy enemy fire, he rescued wounded personnel from a burning landing craft and carried them back to safety. The outstanding devotion to duty and courage under the fire displayed by Lieutenant Andreasen were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. So that was his commendation at Normandy in 1944, and this is part of my confusion. When I go to the official U.S. Naval Records, and I printed up this page, it just has 2 paragraphs about him winning the Navy Cross, and doesn't even mention the Silver Star, but elsewhere I found out that he also won the Silver Star. It actually says he returned to the United States in 1944 and served in the Naval Reserve. So nothing about going to China, which brought about my confusion. But again, digging a little bit deeper, what I found out was he was never allowed to tell anybody where he was. That makes sense. Of course, if you're in charge of going into landing sites ahead of time, you can't tell friends and family where you are. And the U.S. Navy even covered up where he was at particular times. But in fact, what happened, and again, not even in his naval record, that's how top secret some of these assignments were. After the D-Day invasion, he did go back to the United States, but from there, he went to China. Now, it was while in China, and actually there's been a book written about, there's an article that I saw, and I believe there's a book about this. It's called The Rice Paddy Navy. And it turns out that, and it wasn't even disclosed until fairly recently, that the United States Navy sent in Navy SEALs. They were not called that then, but basically special forces. They trained the Chinese Nationalist Army in guerrilla warfare methods. So basically hand-to-hand combat, small arms fire, demolition, sabotage. They were there as the Rice Paddy Navy, meaning they were on land. They were not at sea, but they were training behind the scenes on how to sabotage the Japanese and take on the Japanese army. It was while he was in China that he received a Silver Star. Let me just read a little bit about what was going on in China. And this to me is even probably equally as heroic, if not even more heroic. The Silver Star was awarded in February of 1946, and it states, "The President of the United States takes great pleasure in presenting the Silver Star to Lieutenant Andreasen of the United States Navy for gallantry in action as Executive Officer of U.S. Naval Unit 6 during the Chinese campaign from June to July of 1945. Lieutenant Andreasen led a group of American and Chinese guerrillas against overwhelming odds in number and firepower of the Japanese. On the 10th of July, near Changpu, he pressed the attack with 2 light machine guns. I'm assuming those were Thompsons, but I'm not sure. With 2 light machine guns and 1 heavy machine gun against the Japanese column with such coolness and determination that the enemy was forced to abandon their course and were forced over a mountain trail, where he again ambushed the enemy with great loss of life and captured much needed military equipment. During this engagement, the Major General commanding the Japanese troops was killed. Lieutenant Andreasen's efforts under extremely difficult circumstances were an inspiration to Allied officers and the men serving with him. His courageous actions are in accordance with the highest traditions of the United States Navy." Now, the sword that he sent home, his family said he took it from a Japanese general. I don't believe they said a dead Japanese general, so maybe this is not the sword from the citation, but he did capture a Japanese sword, sent it home. His family still has that. But this gun was not taken from, probably a gift from somebody in the Chinese army. Again, he's helping the Nationalist Army fight the Japanese in clandestine warfare. And even after the war was over, he stayed on and trained with the Nationalist Army. Now, the reason for that really goes to this gun. So let's talk a little bit about that. In the 1920s, actually 1927 all the way up to 1950, the Chinese were in a civil war. Most of you know that it was the communists against the nationalists. So that was Chiang Kai-shek, and not so much Mao Zedong. He came along a little bit after that, but it was basically the communists against the nationalists. Officially, the United States was neutral. Unofficially, we were helping the Nationalist Army first defeat the Japanese. We went over there to help them fight the Japanese, but we stayed on to help them fight the communists, and that was the clandestine part that nobody was supposed to know about. Because of the civil war in China, there was an arms embargo. So the European countries, along with the United States, put an embargo not to sell military equipment to the Chinese to help them in their civil war. Again, they wanted to remain neutral. And so basically they wouldn't sell any kind of machine guns or rifles or military equipment, but pistols were exempt. And that's why these were so popular with the Chinese army. The broomhandle, this was made by Mauser in the 1920s. And about 300,000 of these went to China. Again, they were not part of the embargo, and of course, if you connect this, if you take the stock and you connect it to the gun, it makes for a nice little carbine. They actually had these in Schnellfire or full auto. They went to China. About 300,000 of these Broomhandle C96 Mausers went to China between 1927 and about 1950. Well, let's scratch that because about halfway through the war with Japan, the Chinese, here's a big surprise, the Chinese Counterfeit copied the Broomhandle. So basically they made their own blueprints and they made exact copies of these. At first, what they tried to do is make it look like they weren't counterfeiting. They would make up their own Mauser-marked broom handles. And one of my favorite sections in one of Ian McCullum's Forgotten Weapons, he has caught my interest. He has a video called The Broomhandle Wowzer. Check this out.
Can't get any more real than that, right? It's a wowzer. Someone actually had all the right letter stamps, but didn't necessarily know which way to put them upside down, right side up. And they're not really lined up either. Mauser had one nice stamp that did that whole logo, and it was supposed to be a barrel of gunpowder with the word Mauser written on it.
So that's when the Chinese, even though they got 300,000 of these from Germany, they actually tried to counterfeit them on their own, did a pretty good job. Now, there were 29 arsenals in China, but only about 7 of them that were capable of making these weapons. So at first, and you can see how this thing is kind of jury-rigged a little bit. I don't know what that term means other than they made it work. It would break and they'd fix it. So they were able to repair broken guns. This is pretty beat up. This lanyard is attached, doesn't really help a whole lot, just a piece of string tied on. These grips were the original grips. These are Mauser grips. You can see how worn they are, but they also broke off. But you can see how they tried to fix them once. They broke off again. Now these are Chinese copies of the grips. You can see both sides. They look pretty good, but they don't quite fit right. So many of these guns, you'll find them in various stages of disrepair, very poorly made. But the next step, evidently 300,000 of them wasn't enough. The next step was they began to counterfeit them so that the Mauser people wouldn't know. And these are probably among the worst counterfeits I've ever seen, but enjoyed looking at that. And then finally, they gave up any hint of trying to hide it, and they began to make their own broom handle. And here you see a Chinese copy of the broom handle. Now, the broom handle, the German broom handles, generally came in 7.63 caliber, which once the war broke out with Japan, and by the way, the nationalists and the communists were supposed to have a truce, stop fighting each other, and join together to fight the Japanese. And in reality, the truce was lightly kept. They still had a lot of rivalry between the two groups. They rarely collaborated on the battlefield, continued to fight each other, but the worst of the fighting was curtailed in lieu of fighting the Japanese. They couldn't get a hold of 7.63 ammo, so when they started making their own copies, they used US ammo, which was a lot more plentiful, and therefore they made the broom handle in .45 caliber. Now, if you pick up a Chinese copy, it is much heavier. You can tell right away. It's just a bigger, much heavier copy of the broom handle Mauser. The Chinese copy in .45 caliber is obviously a much more potent and sturdy weapon. Now remember, in terms of getting US ammo, we know the Flying Tigers were over there. We know that the Navy SEALs were over there, and the OSS was over there training them. So they had access to US ammo as long as they were fighting the Japanese. Let's take a look at this stock before we move on. This stock, you can see, well, it is an original stock. The leather has been patched up several times. You can see signs where the straps have been patched up. Again, this is probably an original German, but when it cracked, you can see the repairs where they just put pieces of metal to hold it together. I guess that's the true definition of jury-rigged. It just was held together by tacks and metal strips, but still works effectively. Open it up. You can see this piece is broken off, but you know what? It still works. The whole gun is, it's kind of loose. The grips are loose, and it just feels like a gun that's been repaired several times. Not necessarily dangerous to shoot, and for whatever reason, for all his time in China, again, he went over to China toward the end of 1944, began helping them for the last stages of the war with Japan, and then he stayed all the way through 1946. And why? I understand the sword that was taken from a Japanese general. Why he chose this to send home, I can only imagine that this had some significance to him. I believe this gun was probably carried by a Chinese officer. The U.S. certainly would have given him a 1911 Colt, along with, they actually used Thompson submachine guns. It talks about him using a submachine gun. He would have U.S. issued weapon. But why he brought this home, I would only imagine this had some significance where probably he traded his sidearm for a sidearm of a Chinese officer that he had become friends with. Now that's totally conjecture. I didn't get that from the family, but that's the only thing that makes sense to me. This gun had some sentimental value to Lieutenant Andreasen. So that was not the end of my digging. Not only was he involved in clandestine operations in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, then China, but I found there's a lot of information about the 1945 Army-Navy game. During the war years, the Army-Navy game was suspended because everybody was fighting in the war. But in 1945, after the war had ended, they decided, let's have the Army-Navy game, but they held it in Shanghai, China. And if you remember, Grant had played football in college and actually was an athletic director, and he and one of the other Navy SEALs that he was teamed up with, the two of them co-coached the Navy team. And that year, there's actually pictures. I never knew this. This is new to me. Check it out. There's some pictures of the Army-Navy game held in Shanghai, China. And that year, the Navy won 12-0. And again, Grant was the coach of the Navy team. In 1946, he married Pamela. And you see here, actually, we have a picture of his wedding. He was married in China. He met Pamela in China because her family was stationed over there as part of the U.S. government team, probably the U.S. consulate. They worked out of the consulate, and Pam, or Pamela, to be his bride, she was an interpreter because she spoke 7 different languages, a pretty smart young lady. They met and married in China in 1946, and then immediately after that, they moved back to the United States, and he returned to his farm in Idaho. So one of the anecdotes that I read in some of the literature that I have here actually put a smile on my face. I thought it was pretty funny. So Pam, because she grew up in U.S. embassies and consulates, and particularly in China, they were used to living in a fairly large home, a very nice lifestyle, and they actually had servants waiting on them. And she marries this guy and moves back to the United States, where she now lives on a farm with no indoor plumbing. They only had an outhouse. She must have been quite a lady, very patient woman. Grant then took on a couple jobs, teaching football and teaching physical education. He went to University of California, Berkeley, where he was an assistant coach and also taught in the phys ed department, and then finally got a head coaching job in a city college in California. He died in California. We actually have a picture of his grave. He died in 1997, and Pamela succeeded him several years later, and both of them, you can see here, their final resting place. As I was digging up information about Grant's life, and at the end of it, I thought so much interesting information that nobody ever would have known other than the immediate family if I hadn't really dug deep into this. I would expect, like a lot of our fathers and grandfathers, they just never talked about what they did. They would just considered themselves ordinary people in extraordinary times. I'm not a football player, but can you imagine you go to this college and you're playing football and your coach is just this ordinary guy. You kind of know he was in the Navy, but you have no idea that he was one of the first Navy SEALs. He was at the landing at Normandy. He led the way. He trained over 90,000 Chinese soldiers in guerrilla warfare tactics. So this is your football coach, and you have no idea. I just think that this story is repeated over and over again throughout our country and many of your countries of heroic men, just ordinary men who did heroic things in a very extraordinary time. Thank you for your service, for all those who are serving now, but also as we think about those who have served. Hey, I enjoyed doing this video. I hope you did as well. I know you learned something because I sure did. And this is not one of the most beautiful guns, but it certainly has a very storied past that I really enjoy bringing to you.